Hey everybody, in this video I take a look at Stephen King's 1990 novella collection, 4 Past Midnight. I'll demonstrate what to look for when trying to identify a first US and first UK edition of the book. The first US edition was published by Viking in 1990. There's the author photo on the back. This one is hella common. It was printed, I think, in a 1.5 million copy print run. So it's, arguably, in my opinion, not one of his greater works. And it was printed in huge amounts, so it is fairly easy to find. Like all books from this era, it can be a little bit harder to find it in really nice shape, although patience pays off. I found this one at a thrift shop for about $5. On inside the front cover, look for a price of $22.95. And on the copyright page, very handy, first published in 1990, etc., etc., and then a number line that includes the number 1. Underneath the jacket, black boards, SK's initials underlined in gold, as if to say SK. Put some emphasis on that. Black cloth on the spine with gold lettering, printing. So, you may have noticed, I have kind of a weird feeling about writing in books. Generally it's kind of annoying. Especially with what would be an otherwise really pristine and very valuable book when it has an owner's name or something written in it. But this 4 Past Midnight is not rare, and it's not particularly valuable. It's in really nice shape overall, and I actually don't mind all of these autographs inside. So what I'm kind of pieced together is that maybe this person who originally received this book was a nurse or worked in a hospital or a doctor's office, had to take a leave of absence, and everyone in the office pitched in and bought this book, and they all signed it, almost like a yearbook. A couple of additional signatures in the back. So yeah, it doesn't destroy, to me, the value of a book that didn't have a lot of value to begin with, and it's kind of interesting. Some people would find this unacceptable, but I don't particularly mind. I think it's kind of interesting provenance from the time. But anyway, there is the first US edition. The first UK edition, there's the front cover, was published by Hodder and Stoughton. Back jacket features a different author photo than the US edition. Inside the jacket, look for a price of £14.99 net in UK. And on the copyright page, look for the language first published in Great Britain, 1990. Under the jacket, black boards all around, and gold lettering on the spine. Yep. There it is, the first UK edition. In a side-by-side cover art comparison, the US, as typical, is a little bit more understated, a bit cleaner, arguably. The UK has also, pretty typically, a more elaborate cover art image with this grinning, demony, gargoyle-looking thing. Side-by-side, I would call this a tie. I remember when this book was first released in 1990. I remember seeing it at the store. I remember my grandma buying a copy So I have these kind of emotional, nostalgic attachments to this jacket artwork, but the UK one is a pretty nice alternative. Of course, the image is just overwhelmed by text on the cover, as is also pretty typical. The bigger Stephen King got, the bigger his name became on the covers of the books. But anyway, regardless, they are a nice pair and complement each other pretty well. One of the reasons that 4 Past Midnight stands out in the Stephen King universe is because it has not yet received any sort of special signed limited edition release. There are dozens of releases of Stephen King titles both in the US and the UK, and so it's actually almost easier to build a list of the ones that haven't received some kind of special edition, and 4 Past Midnight is on that list. So I did want to mention that, even though I don't have specifics about cool things that you should look up or seek out, because it does bear mentioning that so far, no special editions of this title. I do these videos because I'm a big fan of Stephen King, and I'm a big fan of collecting Stephen King. I know that I, at times, am a bit of an apologist. I know there's people who just don't see the appeal of Stephen King. They can't get into him. The writing is not literary or classy or highfalutin or pretentious enough or what have you. And so I know that Stephen King fans sometimes almost have blinders to critical analysis of his work. That having been said, with a few exceptions, I don't think I've ever read anything of his that was poorly written. I mean, he's a good writer. He's a talented writer. I've read plenty of things of his that are overwritten, where you think, man, this could have been a really, really tight and amazing longer short story, or a really tight and focused novella. But instead, we end up with a 700-page novel. If he has a downfall and a downside, particularly in the 90s, it was just writing too much. I've read interviews with him where he talks about this, like everything he sits down to write demanded that it just become this ballooned out mammoth pagey wordy type of manuscript. I think it was in one of the introductions to one of his short story collections, where he talks about how that is a unique skill, and one that he actually finds harder and harder to do well as he gets older, particularly because everything he sits down to write demands to be this really long type of thing. But all that to say, 4 Past Midnight is not one of my favorites. 4 Past Midnight, if I ranked all of the novella collections, and there's been a handful, there's been some of the collections that have short stories and novellas, even if I ranked all of the collections of short fiction, period, full stop, 4 Past Midnight, I think, would be at the bottom of that list. I understand in his life that 4 Past Midnight is an important release. It is the first book that he released after getting clean and sort of having a come to Jesus moment with his family, and cleaning up his act, joining AA, all of the above. And he spent, as someone who wrote and produced content that was publishable every single day, with few exceptions, he spent weeks or months where, as in his words, everything that he sat down to write fell apart in his hands like wet tissue paper. So he went through an epic dry spell and a crisis of faith and a crisis of talent, and wondered if his talent was tied to the substance abuse, or if the talent was from somewhere more legit and deep inside of himself. And of course, he eventually picked himself up and found his voice again and proceeded and has been, producing quality work, and in some ways just gets better as he gets older, ever since, for over 30 years. So it's pretty remarkable. But the 4 novellas in 4 Past Midnight were produced as he was coming out of that really difficult and challenging point in his life. And therefore, here I am being an SK apologist again. Therefore, I give these stories a bit of a pass. I don't like abrupt change of subject, but in a way, I'm also a big fan of Metallica, and they released their controversial album Saint Anger, and it's not a great album in my opinion. It's got a weird sound, but then there was an accompanying documentary, Some Kind of Monster, and you realized that in order to remain a productive unit, in order to remain a band, Saint Anger was the album that they had to produce at that time so that they could move on. And in a lot of ways, 4 Past Midnight is sort of in the same boat to me. That having been said, the 4 novellas are not amongst my favorites. If I were giving grades to the stories in the book, Library Policeman, I would say, is my favorite. I would give it a B. The Langoliers, I thought was overstuffed and overwritten, but an interesting concept, despite the giant revelation that's almost laughable at the end of what the Langoliers actually are, what they look like, which, spoiler alert, has a lot to do with Pac-Man. I'd give the Langoliers a C, and the Secret Window, Secret Garden. So I was reading books in chronological order, so I just finished The Dark Half, and the whole time I was reading Secret Window, Secret Garden, I thought, I'm pretty sure I just read this. I just read this story in The Dark Half, and I was not a fan. So Secret Window, Secret Garden, I would give a D. You know, if I hadn't read The Dark Half, like if I'd read The Dark Half years ago, or if I hadn't read The Dark Half at all, and I picked up Secret Window, I might have rated it a lot higher. It's not badly written, it just seemed very repetitive and redundant from The Dark Half, which was written just right before. So it was like him going back to a well that he had just, in a lot of ways, drained dry to cover the same ground again, which I thought was strange. And then my least favorite, the one that just about drove me crazy, was The Sundog. And in a way, it was almost hilarious because, you know, Stephen King is accused, and rightfully so, of overwriting, like writing too much detail, too much padding, too much stuffing. And The Sundog could have been, I think, a really pretty tight 25 or 30 page short story, maybe even shorter than that. But instead, it is intended to be a prequel of sorts to Needful Things, and so has a lot of diversions about the world, the backstory of Needful Things, and then like literally a Polaroid picture. So you snap the picture, film comes out, and it's really a brief thing. It doesn't take much time, maybe a minute, but Stephen King stretches out over dozens of pages a series of photographs in which feature an angry looking, monstrous looking dog that in each picture gets a little bit closer to the real world. And it's an interesting concept. He could have handled it pretty tightly, and it would have been much more exciting and much more gripping. But over the course of all of these pages and all of these pictures, the dog gets a little bit closer, and it was just about the most maddeningly boring thing that I've ever read that Stephen King has written. And like I said, it was almost hilarious in sort of a sick way, but I am not a fan of Sundog. But the library policeman has a really interesting an interesting idea that goes along with it. There's some cultural gender stereotypes that are in these stories that kind of are jarring now, in 2022. Maybe in 1990 they wouldn't have stuck out so badly, but they're a little bit jarring, which I would call these stories somewhat dated for that. But Library Policeman I thought was decent. Langoliers I also thought was decent. The other two I could have done without. But again, like I said, there's a lot of books in the Stephen King bibliography, and this is one. They're not all going to be great, but this was the creative product of a very, very difficult time in his life, and I'm glad that he wrote these stories and that he eventually found his way back into creativity and hasn't looked back since. But anyway, first US, first UK, the only editions, there have been no special editions. There have been editions from across the world in various languages, of course, but no special, no sign, no limited editions of this title yet. But they're good looking. They look nice next to each other on the shelf. And if you are a completionist and you're building your collection and you wanted to include a little bit of everything, then 4 Past Midnight is one you're going to want to pick up. The US, incredibly common book. It can be hard to find it in really good shape, but it is out there. I wouldn't pay more than $10 for a copy, and you know, like I said, the one I got, it's in decent shape. It costs $5. It has signatures all through it, but I actually kind of get a kick out of that. I think that is neat. I don't mind it at all. But anyway, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Bye.